standing together like that, I can't take it.
Hey everybody. Wow, this is like a dance stage. This is something new. Well, good morning, everybody. Happy to be here. I'm Peter O'Sullivan with Quantcast. Talk to you a little bit this morning about viewability. Before we get started, just a show of hands from the buyers in the room. How many of you are actively now buying or monitoring viewability on your campaigns? Show of hands. Okay. And for those who are not, how many plan on doing so in the next probably 3 to 6 months? Okay, so my bet there is that most of you are already doing this, which is what I would expect, given this is a hot topic in the industry today. So hopefully you'll find this information valuable and maybe augment the knowledge that you already have. Before I get started, just a little bit about Quantcast and our perspective and where we're coming from in this space. For those of you who don't know the company, we were an early pioneer in online audience measurement starting back in 2006. And there's two sides to the business. One is online audience measurement, and the second is our RTB programmatic business. So we have a lot of data at Quantcast. We see every single internet user over 800 times a month, and we have insights on over 100 million web destinations globally. So that makes us one of the top 5 data processors in the world. So our vantage point from this presentation is really coming at it from an advertiser perspective, specifically performance advertising and how viewability is affecting these campaigns. So let's get started. So when we originally started thinking about this a couple years back, we really wanted to get some data-driven answers to some of these key questions. Are vendors able to measure viewability consistently and accurately and at scale? What's the average viewability seen in the RTB exchanges? Does buying highly viewable inventory cost more than standard inventory? And does viewability, most importantly, drive better performance for brands and for DR advertisers? And so we looked at all the major vendors out in this space and put them in head-to-head tests over a period of a couple years. We ran over 1.5 billion impressions across 10,000 publisher sites in every major online ad exchange. We optimized viewability for over 300 brands and thousands of campaigns. So what you're looking at here is a pretty good data set that we've compiled over 2 years, and let's walk through now some of the lessons that we've learned. So the first is the MRC accredited vendors are certainly ready today to take on the challenge of measuring and rating on viewability. And this is a big improvement from a couple years ago, where we saw on the left here, you're looking at measurement rates of 3 vendors. 2 years ago, these were down in the 20s and 30s. So 30% of the time, they could actually measure whether or not an impression was in view. We're looking at 3 vendors here on this left-hand chart in the blue. Vendor A and Vendor B are MRC accredited. Vendor C is not. And as you can see with the 2 vendors there, it's pretty good. We're looking at about 75 to 95% measurement rate of the impressions. And what we're finding is that best-in-class companies are right around that area, about 80%. No vendor today is capable of measuring 100% viewability for a variety of technical reasons. But vendor C, as you can see, there is a big drop-off at only 47%. So less than half of the impressions they're able to actually measure. And you can see the difference in the viewability rates on the right-hand side in gray. 59, 56% for vendor A and vendor B. They're only off by, what is that, a couple percentage points. That's pretty close. But vendor C is down at 41%. That's a big, big drop. Now, the MRC, as we know, accredits vendors, and they audit these vendors. And what that basically means is that they inspect the vendors and they're able to pass certain technical requirements for measurement. But there is no standard yet for how they go about measuring viewability. And each vendor does it slightly differently. So that's just something to know when you start looking at viewability vendors. It's important to understand their methodology, how they're measuring, and certainly the key takeaway here is the vendor that you choose really does make a big difference. Next is how much supply is there of highly viewable inventory? And as you can see here, we basically looked at percent of RTB impressions and put them in different buckets. So what's the probability of being viewed? On the left there, you're looking at 0 to 25% probability being viewed, all the way up to 75 to 100% being viewed. This is 2014 versus 2015. 2014 in dark blue there. That's about a year ago when the MRC lifted their advisory on being able to transact on viewability. And what we see here, a couple things stand out. The majority of impressions fall within the 25 to 50% viewable range. And that's about where RTB exchange viewability rates fall. It's roughly 50%, 45 to 50%, depending on the data source you're looking at. But on the higher end, there's very little amount of highly viewable impressions. 75 to 100% probability of being viewed only represents 3% of all of RTB inventory. So if you're working with campaigns and you're thinking of attaching a viewability goal of 65, 70%, 75%, just know that you're going to have a much limited pool of inventory to go after. And that has not changed year over year. What has changed, though, are publishers are making improvements in their content and their sites to make them more viewable. On the left-hand side there, you see the 0 to 25% probability of being viewed. That has decreased markedly. But those sites are being moved into the main category of 25 to 50% probability. So they're not yet moving all the way over to the right, but we think that's going to change. We know that as advertisers and marketers, we obviously want to have an impression served and viewed by the consumer. And publishers today realize that that's where the money is flowing. So we expect this trend to continue. And what about cost? Well, as you can see here, high viewability is typically more expensive. We see this at Quantcast every day. You're looking at an effective CPM index of 100 being the average, and it goes up. 50 to 75%, you can expect to spend about a third more, and 75 to 100% expect to spend almost double. And the reason for this, of course, is supply and demand right now. And many of the publishers that are in this category typically really do care about creating highly viewable sites. They spend a lot of time and testing, optimizing their sites, and creating a good advertising experience. Maybe that's with less advertising on the page, or a vertical type oriented ad that runs and scrolls with the user as they move around the site, things of that nature. But it is more expensive. And that's going to continue. I think as the supply opens up, we'll see more prices rise for those publishers that are providing the best value for the marketers when it comes to viewability. And what about performance? Well, higher viewability definitely drives better performance. What we're looking at here is an educational client, CPA-driven. They decreased their CPA by 50% after optimizing for viewability. You can see the pre there on the left. They were about 40% viewability. They raised it by 20 percentage points. Their cost per conversion went down by 50%, and their CTR went up by a third. So, makes sense. The ads that are in view are seen by the consumer, they can take action. But this can also go the other way. We see marketers today coming with RFPs asking for 75, 80% viewability and still want to hit a CPA metric. And in RTB today, that is just very, very difficult. So we have to decide which metric we're going to go after. And I think the conversation here is about finding the right balance between performance and available inventory. Again, with 3% of the inventory being 75 to 100% viewability, the costs are going to go up and the amount of inventory is going to go down. So when we start to target, we're going to be going after cookies and individuals in the exchanges that we wouldn't normally go after because we're being held to that viewability metric. So it's the balance of finding the sweet spot between those two. And at Quantcast and many other tech companies out there, it's all about machine learning, data, and algorithms to be predictive about trying to understand whether that ad's going to be in view. And let's be clear, it's a prediction. We're dealing with human behavior, right, and many other factors. So it's very difficult to understand if that ad is going to be served in view or not. So the IAB, as we know, has mentioned that 2015 is the year of transition. We know that there is no such thing as 100% viewability, that it's unreasonable is the language they used to think about 100% viewability, but more like 70% viewability, given the nature of the technology, the optimization that needs to happen there, as well as the publisher sites getting more optimized for viewability. But we know that viewability drives better results. We see the optimal campaign performance achieved between 55 and 65%, because again, that's the sweet spot of inventory that's available. But attribution remains a big gap. This is, we think, the second shoe to drop, and we're actively talking to many of the attribution companies out there, and they're all working towards including viewability in some of their data. But this will really separate the good technology companies from those that are just gaming the system, serving multiple ads below the fold that may not be in view, just gaming last-click attribution. We've all seen this. So when those two things come together, that'll really help wring out a lot of the inefficiencies that we're seeing in our media buys. And lastly, mobile and video. Still relatively early here. There's some fundamental hurdles in terms of technology that needs to get ironed out, but those are being resolved as we speak, and we expect some more adoption in those categories. So just in closing, understanding the amount of inventory that's available that's in view is important. Picking a vendor is also very important. Understanding the methodology and using one vendor across all your buys. But also best practice now is certainly working with the buyers and the sellers and negotiating up front what the goals are. How are they going to be calculated? What's the price for that buy? Knowing these things ahead of time so there are no surprises after the buy happens is really a key best practice. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Yes.
Hi. Over here.
Yes.
Hi. I have a question on how you recommend people buy media that is viewable but is not trackable as viewable. You mentioned in the thing that your software only measures at best case 79%. And I know that most viewability tracking is JavaScript based, which doesn't work in flashless environments. Flashless environments are the iPhone, the iPad, all of the inbox, half of device, and it seems apropos to recommend that people buy things that are only trackable as viewable, because you would be missing out on half of available media out there. So I was wondering how you would recommend people, again, buy viewable media that just isn't tracking as viewable.
Yeah, so if I understand your question there correctly, there's two things here. One is the ability to measure and track and understand whether or not an impression is in view, right? So that's one thing, and that's what the MRC tries to do with its standard. May not be a perfect standard, but it's a starting point. And the starting point is designed to move the industry forward, so we can all coalesce around one metric and start to transact. The transaction is a second piece, right? And right now, transacting is a little bit of the Wild West. So there are some buyers that want a much higher amount of pixels in view, as an example, and that's the negotiation piece where we have to have that conversation between the buyer and the seller. So the transaction piece is getting flushed out. There was an interesting article in Ad Exchange the other day about the analogy being with EPA and gas mileage for cars. It's a starting point, but certainly a lot of manufacturers go above and beyond that. And I think that's what we're now starting to see in RTB as it relates to transacting. But at first you have to measure. And so if there's certain things where in mobile or video as an example where the measurement rates just aren't there yet, it makes it a little difficult. So I think as those technologies mature, the transaction piece will follow along with it.
It's actually all the time we have, but you're going to be around, right?
Yeah.
Just for people to chat with
Absolutely.
later? Great.
I'm here.
Awesome.
Thank you very much,
Thank you so
everyone.
much. Okay.